this, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's Virtual Ethical Innovation Lecture, or VAIL as we call it. And as always, I think it's a perfect opportunity to facilitate interdisciplinary discussion focused on the ethical and societal aspects of technology. And we designed this format in a way that technologists could easily drop by for a lunch meeting, basically, listen to interesting minds along the way, meet minds along the way, and also engage in some brief discussion, which hopefully will continue even afterwards. I'm sure some of them already did. And with this, I'd also like to further express my gratitude for the continuing support of the Academy of Humanities and Sciences in Hamburg, who sponsor part of this event. Quick word also about us. The Ethical Innovation Hub is a research group that is a joint venture of both the Institute of Electrical Engineering and Medicine and the Institute for the History of Medicine and Science Studies here at the University of Lübeck. And what we do is we do research on how ethical considerations can be used as a driver for innovation in technology development processes. So integrating ethical considerations into technology development, hopefully for the better in an interdisciplinary, maybe even transdisciplinary way. And with that, I welcome our today's speaker, Professor Bernd Carsten Stahl. Brief look at what we looked at. We looked at a presentation by Mark Bishop about causal reasoning and why it's not the solution in AI. We had some insights from supporting responsible AI in a business context by Pakang Wong. And today, I'm very happy that we have a talk by Bernd Carsten Stahl about the AI for a better future, an ecosystem perspective on the ethics of AI and emerging digital technologies, which happens to be also the title of a book, I think, which you will also promote during your talk. Bernd Carsten Stahl is a professor of critical research and technology at the University of Nottingham, previously at De Montfort University, I think with even the exact same denomination. I'm not entirely sure about that, but he also has another book on case studies in AI ethics, which I think is also a very worthwhile read. And yeah, today you will give your presentation about AI ecosystems and ethics. As I said earlier already, if you have any questions during the presentation, we would be happy if you could use the Q&A window to post them. And first wait until the presentation is over because we're recording. And we'll cut out the Q&A section later of the recording in case anyone doesn't want to be recorded in that matter. But when we reach the end of the presentation, I will give you also the opportunity to ask your questions aloud using your video, your microphone and the webcam, of course. I think today, even more than ever, you can also post your questions in both German and English because Bernd Carsten Stahl is German, I think, or at least speaks it. I'm not sure about the exact origin, Switzerland, but it sounds very German to me. And now, without further ado, I'm very happy for your presentation, looking forward to your presentation, Artificial Intelligence for a Better Future, an ecosystem perspective on the ethics of AI and emerging digital technologies.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction, Christian. Thank you for the invitation. Now I can see that there are 15 attendees. I can't see any of you, which makes it a bit difficult for me to react to the audience. So I have no way of doing that. So I will actually have to speak to my computer for the next few minutes. So I'll try to keep it reasonably short and try to make it more interactive than during the discussion. Right, so I will start by sharing my presentation. Okay, so here you should be able to see now the set of slides. What I will talk you through here, the title, Christian has already mentioned, it's about AI for a better future, and I'm going to talk about an ecosystems perspective. This work came out of a project called Sherpa. The Sherpa project was an EU project that ran from 2018 to 2021. So it's been finished for about a year and a couple of months. And in this project, we looked at ethical and human rights aspects of AI and big data. So in the first half of the presentation, I'll talk you through what we've done in the project, and I will then from there draw some conclusions, which is where this ecosystems idea comes in. In order to understand the ecosystems idea, it does help to understand a bit what we've done. So that's where I'll start. And you can see here this was sponsored by the European Commission. Then I am currently at the University of Nottingham, and I used to be at De Montfort, which is in Leicester, which is about 30 miles away from Nottingham. So I haven't moved a great bit of physical distance, but I have moved to universities recently. Right, so Sherpa project. In the Sherpa project, we've looked at these questions of ethics and human rights through the lens of 5 challenges. And so, as I said, it started in 2018. We wrote the proposal in 2017. The call came out in 2016. The logic of this makes possibly more sense if you think about it from a perspective of 2016 rather than now. 2016 AI ethics was coming up, but it was by far not as obvious and as ubiquitous as it is at the moment. So the first challenge we wanted to address was to understand what exactly are those ethical and human rights issues of what we then call smart information systems. So I use the term smart information systems when I talk about the project. Later on, I will fall back to the more common use now of the term AI. In practice, they're not identical, but they're pretty similar. Right, so first challenge, what is it? What are the problems we're facing here? In order to answer that, we did a set of case studies. We looked at a set of scenarios. We looked at, in particular, the cybersecurity aspect of it. We explored the ethical and social impacts and tensions. So that was a literature study, and we also looked at the human rights component of it. To give you an overview of the case studies, so what we did is we tried to identify organizations that use AI or use smart information systems in their daily practice, and we tried to get insights from a variety of sectors. So we looked at the use of IoT, we looked at government, in particular smart cities, we looked at agricultural applications, so we had government as one set of applications and smart cities as with a particular focus on sustainability as a separate case, and we looked at the use of AI in big scientific research. We looked at insurances, energy, utilities, communication, retail, and manufacturing. So we tried to get an overview of what's out there. And then we thought, well, what's this going to go, or what direction is this going to go into? What's going to happen in the near future? So we selected a set of scenarios where we thought that AI was on the cusp of being realized and being implemented, but might change in the relatively near future. And this is what we looked at there. So we developed scenarios around predictive policing, use of AI in warfare, deep fakes, education, and autonomous vehicles. So that was the first one. So we looked at these cases, these scenarios, the literature to find out what are people concerned about. Then we tried to reach out to broader stakeholders to make sure that our perceptions and insights actually mapped onto what the rest of the world thought. For that purpose, we assembled a stakeholder board, we did interviews, we did an online survey, and we did a Delphi study, which hasn't been published yet, but hopefully will be soon. The next question then was, well, if we understand these issues that people are concerned about, what can we do about them? And in the proposal, we had those 5 bullet points that we said we were going to look into. So we looked into guidelines, we looked into the question of regulation. This is now well before the AI Act, before the AI Act was even floated. This needs to be kept in mind. We looked at standardization and how standards apply to this field. We looked at technical options intervention, in particular security. And we looked at the potential of a regulator and wanted to write the terms of reference for such a regulator. Then the next question was, how can we validate whether any of those suggestions work and in what way they would work, which we did basically through a set of focus groups with stakeholders to find out whether they felt that in their life they would make sense. And then finally, we had the implementation side of things, which any EU project and pretty much any research project has. But I think there are 2 aspects to emphasize here that are not necessarily the norm. So on the one hand, we had an artist who was part of the project who developed a set of really interesting conceptualization of AI and ethical issues that it may raise. And if you go to the Sherpa website, There's a link to, he created his own website called Sherpa Pieces, where he played around with various ideas, which I think is definitely worth a look. And the second thing worth highlighting here is that we have had an advocacy arm to the project. So we actually proactively reached out to stakeholders, in particular to policymakers on the European level, to understand their needs and the current the current debates and what insights they would benefit from. That was really interesting because it coincided with the run-up to the AI Act. So we were very heavily involved in discussions with the Commission and Parliament at the time. Right. So that was sort of the structure of the project, and I will now tell you some of our findings and insights from that. So the first thing is, I'm now switching to the terminology of AI. So what is AI? Right, and you've all come across various definitions. There are tons of them. The first one is from the EU white paper, which predated the Act, where it's a very broad definition, a collection of technologies that combine data, algorithms, and computer power. So that's pretty much anything on a computer. And then you have the more technical definitions, like the one you see at the bottom here from a well-established textbook, where AI is something that mimics human behavior, cognitive capacities, such as perception, memory, judgment, and so on. Now, you may have, I'll come back to the concept of AI in a minute, but we felt that the attempt to define AI is probably not the way forward, so we looked at what do people use AI for, and this is where ethical questions come in. So if you look at the majority of publications on AI where they do talk about why do we want to use it, it's typically about optimization of something. It leads to efficiency, and then if you put this into social context, it's meant to maximize profit. But that's not the only one. There are other purposes, and there could be many, but we picked up two more. Another one is that of social control. So you can use technology, in particular AI, in order to get people to do what you want them to do. And the primary example of that would probably be the Chinese social credit scoring system. But if you look at Zuboff and the surveillance capitalism concept, I think that also goes very much in the same direction. And we suggested that there is another one that you can develop AI with a particular view to human flourishing, and that's the concept that we use to represent the ethical consideration. I'm not going to go into virtue ethics and flourishing, but the reason why I drew this here as a Venn diagram is to show that these are not necessarily contradictory or mutually exclusive. So human flourishing may very well include optimization and profit maximization. You need to generate a certain level of wealth for people to live well. Similarly, the pandemic has shown very clearly that social control may well be required on occasion for human flourishing. So they're not contradictory, but we're saying that there are different types of emphasis you could put on them. Now, this comes back to the concept of AI. The graphic you see here comes from a publication that you see on the left. That was a pro bono publication from Elsevier. I guess everybody knows Elsevier. I think it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, publishers, academic publishers in the world. And they've done a trawl of their Scopus database to look at what are the topics that are discussed within the AI discourse. So they looked at journals and conferences and everything they have, a huge amount of work. They came up with, I think, initially around 800 something keywords that are discussed within the AI discourse, and then they try to combine them. And what you see here is a set of main strands of discourse. And what you can't read, I can't even read it on my own screen, are the keywords around the edges, but you see that there are, I think they've identified 7 main strands, and one of them is machine learning, but there are others such as fuzzy logic, such as optimization. And the interesting thing is that there is no common core that they all have. So AI is a concept that has sort of a family resemblance, but it doesn't have a common core, not in the academic discourse. And that gets even worse if you look at other types of discourses, if you look at the media discourse, if you look at educational discourses, they actually have very different focuses. So instead of defining AI, what we've tried to look at is what do people talk about, in particular in the instances where we talked to people. So for example, in the case studies around what do they mean when they talk about AI. And we've identified 3 groups of meanings. One is the current machine learning focus on a particular type of AI. Then we also have discourses around what we've called here converging socio-technical systems. So these are broader systems where you typically have a machine learning or fuzzy system or some other techie type of AI in the middle, but that are embedded in a broader context. So those might be things like a fraud detection system in a bank. And then finally, there is the idea of general AI or artificial general intelligence or good old-fashioned AI or whatever you want to call it, which is then a truly human or more truly human type of technology than what we currently observe in terms of machine learning and related. So when we talk about those, or when people talk about those, then they have certain characteristics of these technologies in mind, or these uses of the term AI in mind, that raise particular ethical issues. So machine learning, for example, is opaque, it's unpredictable, it needs lots of data. The socio-technical systems are characterized by having significant, potentially social impact. They can manipulate people, and there are questions around autonomy, both of the system itself, but also what it does to the autonomy of humans who are interacting with it. And then there is the AGI, the artificial general intelligence discourse, which then raises fundamental concepts around what is intelligence, what's human nature, what's the relationship between knowledge and reality, and so on. So these are big philosophical questions. Now, using this categorization, you can try to identify certain types of ethical concerns. So the machine learning raises specific issues. The socio-technical systems raise broader questions around how we structure our world, how we structure our societies. And then the AGI type of technologies raise what I've called here metaphysical questions. Examples of those types of problems are the specific machine learning issues are things such as bias discrimination that come in through algorithms or through the data that it's been trained on. Their security issues, their data protection issues. The general questions around how we live in a digital world are then questions around autonomy. So what autonomy do I have? Does the machine have? Questions around power and distribution, things like the future of warfare. And there's a lot of how do society deal with who benefits and who pays the cost. And then for those metaphysical questions, you have things like, will these machines be more intelligent than us? Will there be a singularity event where they become super intelligent? But also more practical questions around how do we change by using or interacting with these technologies. Now, some of these type of issues may be open to particular interventions that can address them. Now, I'm not saying that's easy or that has happened, but I'm saying that there is certainly a lot of research on things like artificial or explainability of AI, about identification of biases and so on. And some of these questions are really political questions. So the question of whether the capitalist gains or the financial gains of the big tech companies, whether they are justified and whether they need responses, these are political questions and they call for political actions. And then some of these questions are really fundamental conceptual philosophical questions. They're not so much questions that can be resolved as questions that are probably going to stay with us. Right, so what I'm trying to do here is trying to draw a picture of the complexity. So we have lots of different types of concerns that people have, from identifiable, describable, maybe even quantifiable ones to very broad philosophical ones. So what can we do about this range of things? And I'm suggesting that there are 4 categories of mitigation measures here. You could carve these up differently if you want. So on the policy and regulatory side, you could have specific regulation such as the AI Act, which the Commission is proposing. But you also have existing legislation, notably human rights law, that can address some of these questions. And you have particular types of laws that now address bits, such as competition law, such as liability law. You might also require new types of regulatory bodies, such as an AI regulator. So that's on the policy level. Companies, organizations can do things that they've already in place and apply them to AI, such as impact assessments, such as quality assurance regimes. Their corporate social responsibility work can cover AI. From a technical perspective, you can look at all sorts of technical measures to address particular issues, such as you can have data protection measures in place through encryptions, through whatever other technical means. But you can also think about how technical development can be guided, for example, through design guidelines, through codes of practice, and so on. And then finally, as an individual engaged in working with AI, you can make use of frameworks. You can be guided by professions, IEEE, BCS, ACM. They all do stuff in the space of AI and ethics. You can employ particular methodologies and so on. So again, the point being, there's a lot out there. It's very complex. Many of these things are overlapping. And the last point of complexity is the question of who does it, who's affected, and who can do something. So who are the stakeholders? I'm suggesting 3 groups here. Again, this might be, you might categorize these differently. So on a policy level, you have everything from things like the EU, big supranational regional bodies, you have national governments, you have policymakers, you have regulators, you have funding bodies, you have ethics committees, national ethics committees that set standards and so on. There are many different types of organizations involved in this. Clearly, those include the ones who build AI, who deploy AI, but also organizations that make use of them, and a lot of organizations around them that have an influence, such as the media, such as educational bodies, such as standards bodies. And then finally, you have all sorts of different types of individuals who make up these activities, including users, lay experts, developers, but also, interestingly and importantly, and typically overlooked, non-users. Right. So the storyline so far is this is pretty complicated. So there is no magic bullet. There is no simple way of saying that's how you deal with the ethics of AI. And that has to do with the epistemic complexity of what is AI in the first place, what are the ethical issues, how would we recognize them. It also has to do with the fact that there are lots of responsibilities that already exist. So these are distributed, these are networked, and the whole field changes rapidly. I think ChatGPT is a lovely example of the fact that something pops up and all of a sudden there's a different type of excitement. So what is required in order to address the ethics of AI, I think, is some sort of intelligent mix of options. And in the Sherpa project, we've decided to run with this, the metaphor of an ecosystem. It's very widely used on the European level, policy level. Many people talk about AI ecosystems. And what we've asked ourselves is, well, if ecosystems are a good way of describing AI, then how can you get ethical considerations embedded in these ecosystems? So therefore, the question here is, how can we move towards an ecosystem of AI for human flourishing? In order to answer the question, it's useful to think about the characteristics of ecosystems first. So ecosystems, as systems in general, typically have unclear boundaries. It's not necessarily clear what's in and what's out, and that can change. So ecosystems are open, members can leave, they can die out, or new members can join. In the innovation management literature, where a lot of the ecosystems references come from that we've used here, evolution is seen as an important driver of change, and that's what makes ecosystems attractive to innovation studies people. So the whole question of things move on, and that changes the overall system. It's important to see that the different members of ecosystems co-evolve, and they can learn from each other. So they can compete, but they can also collaborate. They are interdependent. No member of an ecosystem, whether that's a natural ecosystem or a technical ecosystem, is independent of the others. And the relationships are complex. So it's not easy to predict what those relationships will be and how they will play out in practice for the whole system. So if you have such an ecosystem with these characteristics, what can you do in order to intervene in it? So what if we want to move an AI ecosystem in the direction of human flourishing? What do you have to think about? What are requirements for such interventions? So we've said that there are 3 groups of requirements. Firstly, it's got to be clear what exactly the ecosystem is. So it's got to be delimited. And that means delimitation in geographical terms, in conceptual terms. So what do we mean by AI? What type of AI is involved here? And also in technical terms. That's one thing. Then once you've got your ecosystem, once you've drawn your boundary around it, the next question is what knowledge has to exist in this ecosystem in order for it to be conducive to human flourishing. So there are technical aspects to that. So there needs to be technical know-how, but there also needs to be conceptual and procedural know-how. So for example, there needs to be clear how you can reach out to stakeholders, how you can identify them, how you can co-create positions and so on. And there is the question of how to update this knowledge base. So what capacity building mechanisms need to be in place in order for an ecosystem to be conducive to human flourishing. And finally, there are questions around governance. So what governance structures do you need in order for an ecosystem to be sensitive to human flourishing? And we're suggesting here it needs to be adaptive, it needs to be flexible, it needs to be able to learn. And the last point, this meta responsibility points to the fact that there are lots of existing responsibilities, and there need to be a higher level responsibility to ensure that these are properly aligned and that they create synergies rather than conflicts. Right, so these are three general suggestions on what an ecosystem intervention would require. And then in the Sherpa project, we've then tried to fill that with life. So for each of these three main requirements, we've developed a set of recommendations. So the first one is around conceptual clarity. So for in order to delimit what the ecosystem is, you need to be clear in terms of concepts of the technology, but also in terms of how you understand an ecosystem. It's around drawing the boundary. In terms of governance, we're suggesting that there needs to be some sort of regulatory framework, whether that is a set of legislation or takes another form, it's a different question. We're suggesting that there should be a body that is responsible for overseeing this regulation and implementation of the regulation. And because Sherpa was an EU project, we've suggested that this might be an EU agency. And we've taken the Human Rights Agency as an example of what it might look like. And then finally, we've suggested that on the organizational level, there should be somebody who should feel responsible. And we've called this role an AI ethics officer. And that's modeled along the idea of a data protection officer as proposed or required by the GDPR. And then finally, in terms of knowledge, what knowledge has to exist within the ecosystem. So we're suggesting that there should be a baseline understanding of an AI impact assessment. How would you do that? We've developed a set of guidelines around ethics by design. These guidelines actually have been adopted by the European Commission as part of the guidance for ethics for AI for Horizon Europe. We are suggesting that training and education needs to be in place, that standardization can play a key role, and that there are specific security-related issues that need to be picked up. So you can see we have 9 different recommendations in 3 groups here, and it is important to realize that these while they're all individual standalone recommendations, and you can look at them in a lot more detail on our website, it's important to realize that they actually need to be looked at in conjunction. So the different groups interact. For example, you need to delimit your ecosystem in order to say what exactly the knowledge base should be. And similarly, the knowledge base can inform the delimitation. The same is true for the other ones. So the governance structure may incentivize the creation of knowledge, whereas the knowledge will inform the governance structure. The governance structure needs to be specific to a particular system. So that these 3 bubbles, the main bubbles are interrelated. And the same is true for the individual recommendations within the bubbles. So a regulatory framework, for example, could require an agency, it could mandate the existence of an ethics officer. An ethics by design process could draw on and include impact assessment, would require training, standardization, and particular knowledge around things like security. And you also have sort of cross linkages. So if you had an AI ethics officer, they would probably need to be trained in a certain way. If you had a regulatory framework, it could require an AI impact assessment, and so on. So this is the way we've drawn this on the website. So this is taken from the website. you see our 3 main bubbles and the individual recommendations around the side of that. And with that, I come to the end. So as Christian has said earlier, I have 2 books out on this. The one on the left is really the conceptual side of it, which is a more detailed narrative around what I've just told you. And the one on the right, which just came out a couple of months ago, is an attempt to discuss what these implementations of AI ethics might look like in practice, using cases that are well discussed in the literature, like the compass, the American, what is it? The system that's used for parole decision, compass, and many others. So we picked from the public debate around ethics of AI and tried to discuss what the implementation of our recommendations might look like in practice. They're both open access, so you can both download them and read them for free. So it saves you a few quid.